Have you ever paused, maybe while watching a child, navigate their first day of school, or even just reflecting on your own journey, and genuinely asked yourself, who am I really? It seems like such a simple, almost childlike question, doesn't it? But if you dig just beneath the surface, that seemingly innocent query unlocks an entire fascinating world of psychological drives, motivations, and the very core of what makes us, well, us. It's a question that resonates with every single one of us, I think, from the moment we start forming our earliest memories. And today, we are going on a deep dive into precisely that. The fundamental forces that shape how we perceive ourselves, how we interact with the world, and crucially, how we learn. We're drawing from an incredible body of work that truly unpacks the intricate dynamics of psychological identity. For anyone curious about human behavior, but especially for you, our listener, with your background in elementary education and your fresh interest in identity and psychology, well, this deep dive is going to be packed with practical, immediately applicable insights, I think.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is to truly unpack how two core motives, the drive to see ourselves positively, which we'll call self-enhancement, and the drive to see ourselves accurately, or self-assessment, are constantly interacting. Think of them like an accelerator and a brake, always pushing and pulling. These forces influence not just how we perceive ourselves, but our very actions, our choices, our persistence. Understanding this dynamic push and pull is absolutely crucial for anyone involved in guiding learning and development, particularly elementary educators. It directly impacts how children see themselves in the classroom, how they engage with new information, how they respond to feedback, and ultimately, how they develop into resilient, self-aware individuals.
Okay, let's unpack this then. This deep dive isn't just theory, it's really going to provide insights that you can apply directly to understanding your young learners, their triumphs and their struggles, and frankly, even yourself, right? And your own responses to the world around you. So let's begin at the very foundation. What is psychological identity? Our source defines it not as some static, fixed thing that we're born with, but as a profoundly dynamic, evolving process. It's that existential intuition, that explicit apprehension of being something. It's that deep internal sense of, I am X. To put it simply, a physical object like a chair, logically is a chair, its identity is pretty straightforward. But when we talk about a person, say, I am a student or I am a good friend, that's psychological identity. It's profoundly subjective, deeply personal, and continually constructed through our human experience. It's not just a label, it's an internal narrative, a story we tell ourselves about who we are. And for you as an educator, this distinction is truly profound, isn't it? It means understanding that a child's sense of who I am isn't just about their name or their physical appearance or even their designated role as a student in your class. It's about that internal narrative. They're constantly building the stories they tell themselves about their abilities, their relationships, their strengths, their areas for growth. Recognizing this allows you to tap into a much deeper level of motivation and understanding in your classroom, I think.
Precisely. And for this complex psychological identity to even begin to emerge, certain foundational cognitive capacities are absolutely necessary. Our source points to two key ones that really set humans apart. The first is symbolic language. Human beings are uniquely adept at representing objects, ideas, and even themselves with symbols, words, images, gestures, and then flexibly and creatively manipulating those symbols in rule-governed ways to convey incredibly nuanced meaning. This isn't just about the words we speak, it's about our ability to create abstract definitions for ourselves and for others, to categorize, to understand attributes beyond the immediate concrete experience. Think about this in your elementary classroom. From a very young age, children use language constantly to define themselves and their world.
Right.
They might say, I'm a good helper, I'm fast at running, I'm a reader. These aren't just simple descriptions. They're profound building blocks for their developing self-concept. Language allows them to articulate, internalize, and refine these nascent identities. It's how they begin to understand their unique attributes and their place in the social tapestry of the classroom.
That makes so much sense. It's the very foundation of how we communicate, but also how we self-identify. Okay, and the second capacity.
The second is reflective thought. This is another hallmark of human cognition. Unlike most non-human animals, who are generally mentally tethered to the concrete, the actual, and the immediate here and now, human beings possess this extraordinary ability to freely contemplate the abstract, the possible, and the temporally distant, both the past and the future. This capacity allows our minds to embrace conceptual and intangible ideas, to consider hypothetical scenarios, and to imagine things that aren't immediately present. We can mentally time travel, so to speak. This capacity is incredibly powerful for identity because it allows children to imagine possible selves. A first grader, maybe struggling with a new skill, can think, okay, I might struggle with this math problem today, but I can get better if I practice. Or an aspiring artist might imagine, I could be a great artist when I grow up. This isn't just idle daydreaming. It's a crucial cognitive function that lays the groundwork for motivation, for setting goals, and for developing resilience in the face of challenges. It allows them to envision who they might become, which is a deeply motivating force for learning and growth.
Right, okay. So with these foundational capacities, symbolic language and reflective thought, we start to build up these incredibly rich, articulate, and distinctive self-controls. Our source outlines a few key dimensions of self-control, the varied ways people see themselves. First, there are what we call enduring characteristics. These are the traits and habits encoded in our semantic memory. Think of them as long-term, abstract attributes that are fairly stable over time, like I am kind, I am curious, or I am brave. These are the persistent parts of our self-definition that tend to hold true regardless of specific events or, fleeting moods. Then there are possible selves, which you just touched on. This is how we see ourselves as we might be. Hypothetical future versions, like the future astronaut, or even counterfactual versions, like I could have done that differently. These possible selves are remarkably powerful. They provide a dynamic framework for interpreting and evaluating our actual current self. For instance, if a child envisions themselves as a future scientist, they might interpret a failed science experiment not as a personal failing, but as a necessary step on the path to learning and discovery, maybe a temporary setback on the way to becoming that possible self. This vision guides their interpretation of current events. It's pretty cool. And finally, our identity has a remarkable capacity for extending beyond personal boundaries. It doesn't just stop with me as an isolated individual. We readily extend our self-controls to include other people, groups, social roles, and even inanimate objects. Consider a child who identifies strongly as a member of Mrs. Smith's class, or a friend to Lily, or even the owner of this special toy. These collective and relational identities significantly shape their individual self-control, creating a much richer and more interconnected sense of self. It's not just about who I am in isolation, but who I am in relation to others and the world around me. And understanding that is really key for fostering community in your classroom, isn't it?
Absolutely. Given this vast and intricate landscape of self-controls that we build, it's important to pinpoint what truly constitutes the core of identity. Our source clarifies that it's not all self-controls that are equally central, but rather a consequential subset that possesses three key, often correlated properties. First, these core self-controls are central. They occupy the foreground of the mind, meaning they are either acutely accessible, brought to mind by immediate cues, like thinking I'm an artist when you see a paintbrush, or chronically accessible, always sort of simmering there, perhaps influencing how you interpret new information about art. For example, a child who is habitually gender schematic, meaning they consistently organize and interpret information about themselves and others primarily through the lens of gender, might always perceive themselves and their capabilities through that specific framework, making boy or girl a chronically central aspect of their identity. It's always kind of on. Second, these core self-controls are essential. These are characteristics subjectively seen as intrinsic or inevitable, implying a fundamental theory about what one necessarily is or can be. Again, one's gender identity is a very strong example here, but it could also be a child who deeply feels, I am a creative person, seeing that as an intrinsic, unchangeable part of who they are, rather than just a skill they sometimes employ. It feels fundamental. And third, they're important. These are the self-controls that truly matter to people. They are imbued with significant motivation and value. If a child values being a good student, that becomes an important part of their identity, and it will powerfully motivate their academic efforts, their study habits, their engagement in the classroom. Our source notes that these three properties, central, essential, important, are often strongly correlated, forming what they call a prototypical identity that people feel deeply committed to and that crucially profoundly impacts their behavior. This isn't just a label. This is the part of who I am that really drives the bus of our actions and choices.
And building on that, it's absolutely critical to clarify the distinction between identity, as we've been discussing it, and the broader, more encompassing concept of self. Our source makes a clear point. Identity is fundamentally a cognitive aspect of the self. It's a subset of all those self-controls we just talked about. The enduring characteristics, possible selves, extended boundaries, all that stuff. You can think of identity as the blueprint of a house. The detailed plans, the architectural designs, the specific rooms and their designated functions, it tells you what the house is. But the self is a much broader, more encompassing entity. It's the entire house in its full three-dimensional reality. It includes the foundation, the furniture, the people living in it, all the experiences happening within its walls, the warmth, the sounds, the smells. The self is the locus of coordinated cognition, your thoughts, volition, your will, your capacity to choose, and action. It's the who that entertains these self-construals, the one that experiences emotions and desires, and the one that actually acts in the world. You can change the blueprint. Your identity might shift and evolve over time, but there's always a house, yourself, that experiences that change. This distinction is vital because it means identity never develops in a vacuum. It's always intimately intertwined with our feelings and our capacity to act.
Exactly. And this brings us directly to why identity truly matters and why these distinctions are so important for understanding human behavior, especially in a learning environment. Identity-relevant self-construals have powerful effective consequences. People don't just passively observe their identities. They actively seek self-construals that bring pleasantness and diminish unpleasantness. This is where the core identity motives come into play. Our source introduces 3 fundamental self-evaluation motives, though we'll be focusing primarily on 2 today, and a third, self-verification, will receive a more dedicated spotlight later. The first is self-assessment. This is the inherent drive to see oneself accurately, favoring true self-construals, even if those truths aren't always flattering. This is our brake, the force that grounds us in reality. The profound hedonic benefit here is that it forestalls the anxiety and discomfort that being uncertain about oneself would create. It's about clarity, really, about knowing where you stand. The second is self-enhancement. This is the powerful drive to see oneself positively, favoring positive self-construals. This is our accelerator, the force that pushes us towards optimism and self-regard. The crucial hedonic benefit here is that it forestalls the pain and discomfort of being self-critical or feeling inadequate. It's about feeling good about yourself. And the third motive, which often plays a complex role in conjunction with the first 2, is self-verification, the drive to see oneself consistently, favoring familiar self-construals, even if those familiar views are negative. Its benefit is forestalling the confusion and psychological disarray that comes from feeling unpredictable or inauthentic. We'll definitely unpack this one more fully later on.
It's incredibly fascinating to think about the directional operation of these motives, whether we're primarily pursuing a desired identity or desperately trying to escape a feared one. What's particularly insightful from the source is the emphasis on protection versus promotion. The research highlights that protecting oneself, preventing negativity, or avoiding a damaged self-image is often a far more urgent and powerful motivator than promoting it, seeking even greater positivity or, reaching for the absolute peak of self-actualization. Think about this dynamic in your classroom and you'll recognize it instantly, right? A student might work significantly harder, perhaps burning the midnight oil, to avoid a failing grade, that feeling of being a failure at school, which is a powerful protection motive, than they might to achieve an A+ desire. If they already feel reasonably competent, the immediate, tangible threat of a negative identity, failing a subject, can be a much more powerful motivator than the incremental gain of an even more positive one, an A+. It's about damage control for the self, the urgent need to maintain a baseline level of positive regard, and understanding that changes how we might motivate or support them.
That's a truly insightful way to frame it. And to really grasp the dynamic tension between self-enhancement and self-assessment, it helps to consider their opposing directions of fit. This is a philosophical distinction, actually, borrowed from philosophy of language, but incredibly useful when applied to psychological motives. Let's start with self-enhancement. This motive has what we call a world-to-mind direction of fit. What this means is that the goal is to make how one actually is, the world, match how one construes oneself, the mind. In essence, the accelerator prompts people to defy or at least reinterpret reality to fit a desired self-image. It's about bending your perception of the external world, or even your past actions, to align with your preferred self-view. You want the world to reflect your desired internal state. In contrast, self-assessment has a mind-to-world direction of fit. This aims to make how one construes oneself, the mind, match how one actually is, the world. It's about deferring to reality, acknowledging the truth, even if it's inconvenient. The break prompts people to accept and align their self-perception with what's objectively true about themselves. The key idea here is that these 2 motives are often in direct tension, actively competing for dominance within our minds. Consider a student in your class who has just received a less-than-stellar grade on a history test. One student might immediately insist, that test was unfair, the questions weren't what we studied, and the teacher grades too harshly.
Right, the blame game.
Exactly, that's self-enhancement in action, defying reality to maintain a positive self-image as a good student.
Another student, however, might approach you, look at their answers, and say, can you show me exactly where I went wrong on questions 3 and 5? I really want to understand where I need to improve. That's self-assessment, deferring to reality to learn and grow, even if it means acknowledging a current shortcoming. This competition between the accelerator and the brake shapes so much of how we respond to information about ourselves and impacts our capacity for growth. It's happening all the time.
Okay, now that we understand the basic motives and their opposing directions, let's really dive into the accelerator in action. The motive to self-enhance is incredibly pervasive, and we see signs of it everywhere, both obvious and subtle. Our source describes these as prima facie signs. One of the most common and easily recognizable is the self-serving attributional bias. This is where people tend to take full credit for their successes, but quickly deny responsibility for their failures. Think about a student in your classroom. I got an A on my project because I'm so smart and I work so hard when it goes well. But if they receive a low score, it immediately shifts to, the teacher made the test too hard, or my desk partner kept distracting me, or, I was just having an off day. It's a fundamental way we protect our ego. Another obvious sign is simply favorable self-evaluation on a global scale. Research consistently shows that, across cultures, people tend to evaluate themselves overwhelmingly positively. This general positivity leads to what are known as positive illusions, which are mildly inflated, often beneficial, perceptions of one's own merits, personal control over life events, and future prospects. The classic example here is the better-than-average effect. Most people rate themselves as superior to others on a wide variety of desirable dimensions. And this isn't just about skills. It even extends, somewhat ironically, to people rating themselves as less biased than others. In your classroom, if you were to ask most students to rate themselves on a scale of kindness, helpfulness, or even intelligence compared to their classmates, a significant majority would almost certainly rate themselves as above average, wouldn't they? Even though mathematically that's impossible for most of a group. It's a common, powerful, and deeply ingrained human tendency to see ourselves in the best possible light.
Moving to more subtle prima facie signs, we see what's called implicit self-positivity. This is where things linked to the self, like one's own name, one's face, or even one's possessions, spontaneously and often unconsciously take on a positive value. It's been aptly called the Midas-like effect, drawing on the ancient Greek myth of King Midas, who turned everything he touched into gold, because everything the self touches, in a sense, turns positive. This phenomenon is measured by intriguing tasks like the name letter task, where people implicitly prefer letters that appear in their own name, or the implicit association test, which reveals these subconscious preferences. It's astonishingly robust and has been observed across various cultures. People even unconsciously gravitate towards locations, occupations, and romantic partners whose names sound similar to their own. It's a testament to this subtle self-positivity at work. For your students, this might subtly manifest in their preferences. A child might have an unconscious preference for a book character whose name starts with the same letter as theirs, perhaps, or express a stronger desire for a classroom job that aligns with their initial. It's a subtle but powerful demonstration of this self-positivity at work, operating even below conscious awareness, subtly shaping their interactions and choices.
That's incredible to think about, though. We have these biases that we're not even aware of. But for a listener just learning about this, it might sound like our brains are just playing tricks on us, or these are just cognitive shortcuts. How can we be sure there's genuine motivation at play behind these signs, rather than just purely cognitive factors?
That's a critical and excellent question. While some alternative explanations of a dry cognitive sort have indeed been proposed, for instance, that name preferences are simply about familiarity or better-than-average effects are mere statistical artifacts, our source strongly argues, with compelling evidence, that motivated self-enhancement does play a significant and irreplaceable role. These signs of self-positivity persist even when those cognitive confounds are rigorously controlled. For example, implicit self-esteem, which is a measure of this subtle self-positivity, doesn't just passively exist. It actually decreases significantly after an ego threat.
Ah, interesting.
Demonstrating a clear motivational component. When our positive self-view is challenged, the system that supports it responds defensively. Our source even poses a wonderfully thought-provoking question to highlight this. Are parents' judgments that their own children are superior to other people's children, judgments that cover strongly with parents' own self-esteem, likely to be solely attributable to cognitive factors? The implication is clear, isn't it? There's a deep, emotionally charged, and highly motivated bias at play here. It's not just about what we observe, but what we want to believe.
That's a powerful point. Okay, Beyond these general, often unconscious signs, the case for self-enhancement becomes even more compelling when we look at specific processing dynamics which directly implicate motivated bias. Two types of dynamic processes stand out. First, we have memory selectivity. People tend to conveniently forget unfavorable predictions made about them, especially when those predictions concern central aspects of their identity, but they have excellent recall for favorable ones. For instance, a student might conveniently forget the details of a less than stellar report card from earlier in the year, particularly if being a good student is central to their identity, but they can vividly recall every detail of an award they received, down to what the teacher said and how they felt. Our memory isn't a passive recording device. It's often a curator of our self-image. Second, there's partisan reasoning. This is where people engage in biased processing of information. They think harder about, critically doubt, and meticulously check information that threatens their self-image, compared to information that simply reassures or confirms their positive view. Imagine a student in your class who has just received some critical feedback on a creative writing assignment. Instead of immediately absorbing it, they might spend more time trying to find flaws in the feedback itself, questioning its fairness, or debating its validity with the teacher, rather than simply accepting it. It's a powerful mental defense mechanism, a subtle but persistent effort to preserve that positive self-image from any perceived assault.
Exactly. And beyond these cognitive biases and memory tricks, these self-enhancing dynamics exert significant and observable behavioral effects. One striking and somewhat counterintuitive example is self-handicapping. This is when people intentionally create an excuse for potential poor performance before they even begin a task, specifically to preserve their self-regard. They're afraid they might fail, so they proactively do something that provides a ready-made external excuse for that failure, thereby protecting their internal self-perception. In the classroom, this is starkly visible sometimes. Imagine a student who is genuinely anxious about an upcoming math test. Instead of studying, they might intentionally stay up late playing video games the night before, knowing full well it will impair their performance. That way, if they failed, they can simply say, "Oh, I barely studied, that's why I did badly," rather than having to admit the more painful possibility that they might not be good at math. It's a preemptive strike against ego damage, a way to attribute failure to external circumstances rather than internal ability. It's a sad but fascinating demonstration of this protection motive.
That's such a common dynamic you see with kids, and frankly, with adults too. It's that protective mechanism at work. And it gets even more complicated when you consider how we interact with others. Our source discusses the powerful implications of the self-evaluation maintenance model, which suggests that we might even subtly undermine the performance of close friends or family if their success threatens our own identity in a domain we deeply care about. Let's illustrate this in a classroom setting. Say being the best artist in the class is a core part of a child's identity, something they truly value and derive self-worth from. Now, if their close friend creates an absolutely amazing drawing, perhaps even better than their own recent work, the child might, perhaps unconsciously, subtly downplay their friend's work to others, or even find ways to distract their friend from finishing a project, like interrupting them during art time or suggesting they move on to something else. It's an unconscious effort to protect their own identity, to maintain their unique shine, when someone close to them excels in a domain that's central to their self-worth. It's not necessarily malicious in a conscious sense, but rather a profound manifestation of self-enhancement.
Another crucial psychological phenomenon where self-enhancement plays a powerful, often uncomfortable role is cognitive dissonance. The classic finding goes like this. Participants were induced to lie about a boring activity, telling someone else it was interesting. Afterwards, they strangely convinced themselves that the activity wasn't so boring after all. Initially, this was thought to be about simply avoiding incompatible beliefs, holding two contradictory thoughts. However, later research, supported by abundant evidence, has revealed a deeper truth. Dissonance effects are largely driven by the perception that one has voluntarily and foreseeably caused harm, or acted inconsistently with one's deeply held values, thereby violating identity-related standards such as be honest or competent. It's essentially self-protective rationalization. So imagine a student who, under pressure, copies answers from a peer during a test. Afterwards, to alleviate the unpleasant tension of dissonance, they might rationalize their actions by saying, "Everyone does it," or "The assignment wasn't fair anyway," or "The teacher didn't explain it well enough." This reduces the internal conflict between their actions and their self-perception as a good person or an honest student, thereby protecting their identity. It's a powerful mental trick we play on ourselves to feel better.
So, if self-enhancement is truly a strong motive, then satisfying that need in one area should theoretically reduce or even eliminate these other self-enhancing phenomena, right? If the accelerator gets its fuel, it won't need to push so hard elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we see with the remarkable effects of self-affirmation. If people engage in self-affirmation, that is, they take a moment to indicate, list, or elaborate upon values central to their identity, things that truly define them and make them feel good about themselves, then the standard effects of cognitive dissonance are dramatically short-circuited and partisan reasoning decreases. It's like giving the self a burst of healthy fuel from a different source. Consider this powerful classroom example from the source's research. Having students take 5 minutes before a difficult math test to write about a value important to them, perhaps something like, I am a kind friend, or I am a creative problem solver, or I am someone who helps others. The source shows this simple act of self-affirmation can actually increase school grades for struggling students.
Wow, really? And just from that?
Yes. This is because it helps students feel secure enough in their broader affirmed identity to be more open to potential struggles or constructive criticism in the specific domain of math. They're less defensive because their core self-worth isn't under attack. This substitutability, where affirming the self in one way can reduce the need for self-enhancement in another, strongly suggests a common motivational core related to our drive for self-positivity.
Okay, now, if self-enhancement is this powerful accelerator, constantly pushing us to see ourselves in the best possible light, let's shift our focus to the brake, the motive to self-assess, which keeps that accelerator in check. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think, because it highlights those crucial moments when accuracy and modesty actually prevail over our inherent desire to be awesome.
That's a perfect way to transition. One compelling piece of evidence for the self-assessment motive is that better-than-average effects, that pervasive self-enhancement bias, occur most strongly on ambiguous traits, but significantly less, or not at all, on well-defined ones. Think about a child in your classroom. They might confidently say they're better than average at being a good friend, which is a subjective and ambiguous trait, right? Open to wide interpretation. But they'd be much more accurate and modest when assessing their ability to spell specific words like cat or house, because that's a well-defined skill with clear right or wrong answers. When there's little room for mental maneuver, people lean strongly towards self-assessment. Similarly, our source notes that people tend to exaggerate academic grades when their recollection is fuzzy, but not when it's clear. A child might remember their test score as slightly higher than it actually was, especially if they didn't look at the exact grade slip or was a while ago. But if they're holding the grade in their hand, the evidence is undeniable, and there's no room for fuzzy recall. The brake engages because reality is undeniable. Another fascinating point is what's called explanatory introspection. When people are prompted to actively write down reasons why they might or might not possess a particular trait, they consistently rate themselves less positively on those traits compared to when they don't do this reflection. This activity actively encourages even-handed thinking, forcing a more balanced consideration of both strengths and weaknesses. So in your classroom, asking students to reflect not just on what they did, but why they think they succeeded or struggled on a group project, prompting them to consider both their contributions and areas for improvement, rather than just declaring the project good, leads to more accurate and nuanced self-assessment.
And social dynamics play a really significant role here, don't they? It's not just an internal process.
Absolutely. Social accountability, the expectation that you might have to justify your self-evaluations to others, powerfully curtails self-enhancement. It often works by increasing attention to weaknesses because you know someone else might probe or challenge your claims. Imagine a student presenting their group project to a peer group or to the whole class and having to explain their process, their choices, and their individual contributions, rather than just stating their opinion that it was great. That external need to justify their self-evaluation prompts a far more realistic view, forcing the brake to engage. Finally, we see that people with genuinely negative self-views sometimes actually disdain favorable feedback, finding it inauthentic or unhelpful, and instead strongly prefer diagnostic feedback over just general positive feedback. A student who truly believes they struggle with reading, for instance, might find a blanket statement like, "You're doing great," unconvincing, or even irritating. Instead, they might much prefer a reading specialist to point out specific areas for improvement, like, "You're doing well with decoding, but let's work on your fluency when you encounter multisyllable words." Even if it's negative in the sense of highlighting a weakness, They're seeking the truth that will genuinely help them improve. They want accuracy, not just empty praise.
So what specific conditions allow this self-assessment break to operate more effectively? Because it seems like the accelerator is always so dominant.
You've hit on a crucial point. It largely boils down to cognitive resources. Self-assessment, by its very nature, requires reason and mental effort. When our cognitive resources are limited, for example, if we're distracted, mentally busy, under time pressure, or just plain tired, the accelerator of self-enhancement tends to take over. Our source mentions that distracted people endorse more positive traits and deny negative ones. This is also why people who truly lack competence in a specific domain often overestimate their abilities significantly. This is famously known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. They don't have the metacognitive capacity, the very self-awareness, to accurately assess their own limitations, precisely because those cognitive resources are stretched thin. In your classroom, this has direct implications. A tired, overwhelmed, or anxious student might blindly agree that they are good at everything or quickly claim they get it just to move on because they lack the mental energy to engage in genuine self-reflection. In contrast, a student with full mental energy, feeling rested and unburdened, can pause, truly reflect, and give a much more honest and accurate assessment of where they stand. Creating a calm, supportive environment can literally facilitate more accurate self-assessment.
That makes perfect sense. The brain defaults to the easiest path, which is often self-enhancement, unless there's dedicated effort. But here's a fascinating interplay. Our source points out that self-assessment can actually facilitate self-enhancement. It's not always a head-to-head competition. Sometimes they work together.
That's a crucial and nuanced insight, and it's where the growth mindset truly comes into play. This happens in what we call tactical self-enhancement. To truly improve one's standing on an attribute, which is fundamentally a long-term form of self-enhancement, knowing one's true current standing through honest self-assessment is a necessary precondition. This is a form of delayed self-gratification, where you defer the immediate feel-good of self-enhancement for a greater, more authentic, and more enduring positive self-view in the future. Think of a student who genuinely assesses their current writing skills, meticulously identifying specific weaknesses in their grammar, sentence structure, or narrative flow. They do this not because they want to feel bad about their writing, but precisely because they understand that honest, accurate assessment is the only way to truly improve and eventually become a better writer to reach that possible future self.
So accuracy serves the long-term goal of being better.
Exactly. This embodies a powerful growth mindset, embracing current reality to shape a better future. They defer immediate ego gratification for the long-term goal of actual improvement, which ultimately leads to a stronger, more accurate, and more positive self-view. This interplay illustrates the profound significance of imagining and working towards possible future selves in the dynamics of identity.
So what are the real-world consequences of these powerful, often competing motives? It sounds like it's a really complex and mixed bag, not a simple case of one being good and the other bad.
It absolutely is, and that complexity is what makes this field so rich. When we look at psychological well-being, the findings are intriguingly two-sided. On one hand, research suggests that moderately inflated self-ratings, whether of one's own attributes, one's control over fate, or one's future prospects, actually predict good psychological adjustment, higher levels of happiness, fewer psychiatric symptoms, and even more successful coping with adversity or illness. A healthy, not extreme dose of self-enhancement seems to provide a kind of psychic fuel that helps us maintain positive mood and perseverance. On the other hand, thinking too much better of oneself than others do can predict poor social and academic adjustment and impaired social relationships. It can also negatively predict occupational performance. For instance, while generally high self-esteem is correlated with positive outcomes, extreme or baseless self-esteem is sometimes linked to antisocial behavior, though generally people with genuinely high, secure self-esteem are less prone to delinquency. So it really is about finding that optimal balance, you know.
So it's not just about having high self-esteem, but the quality of that self-esteem that truly matters. Because the term self-esteem often gets thrown around without much nuance.
Precisely. Researchers make a crucial distinction between secure self-esteem and its more fragile or defensive counterparts. One way this fragility is operationalized is through narcissism, which is viewed as a spectrum rather than just a clinical disorder. While normal narcissism can correlate with some adaptive traits because it shares variance with healthy self-esteem, it also correlates with subtle indices of fragility. Narcissist positive affective states, though chronically high, also tend to fluctuate more dramatically. They often exhibit lower implicit self-esteem, which is a subtle, often unconscious sign of underlying insecurity. Importantly, narcissism predicts antisocial behavior beyond just general levels of self-esteem. It's the kind of self-regard that matters. Another critical aspect of self-esteem quality is its contingencies of self-worth, what our self-esteem is based on. For example, basing self-worth predominantly on God's unconditional love or genuine moral character might be more adaptive and stable than basing it solely on fluctuating factors like physical appearance, academic grades, athletic prowess, or pure popularity. If a child's self-esteem is contingent primarily on being the smartest or the prettiest in the classroom, it can be incredibly fragile. A bad test score or a perceived slight from a friend can trigger a significant dip in their self-worth, leading to emotional roller coasters. As educators, understanding these contingencies allows us to help broaden a child's sense of worth beyond a single vulnerable domain. This leads beautifully to the concept of self-compassion, which is emerging as a healthier, more robust alternative to traditional self-esteem. It involves being kind to oneself despite imperfections, acknowledging our shared humanity in struggling, and taking a balanced view of our painful thoughts and feelings. Self-compassion yields significant adaptive benefits that often surpass those of self-esteem, and it is inversely associated with fragile self-esteem. For educators, this means actively encouraging self-compassion when a student makes a mistake, saying things like, "It's okay to make errors, that's how we learn and grow," or "Everyone struggles with new concepts sometimes, that's part of the process." This approach, focusing on effort and learning rather than solely external validation or perfect performance, helps build resilience and a more secure sense of self.
That's a truly crucial point for the classroom, shifting the focus from just being good to learning and growing. And we saw earlier how self-affirmation could attenuate the need for self-enhancement, but how does it play out in terms of these long-term consequences and the quality of self-esteem?
It's remarkably beneficial and robust. When people are allowed to affirm important values central to their identity, we see a fascinating shift. Defensiveness is replaced by genuine openness, and many of the self-enhancement biases we discussed earlier simply disappear. The broad benefits are significant. Our source mentions research indicating it can increase school grades, particularly for students from marginalized groups, and even improve immune system parameters.
Immune system, that's wild.
It is. This isn't a magical cure-all, of course, but it suggests self-affirmation might work by attenuating the need to self-enhance in a defensive way, by boosting the overall quality of self-esteem, or perhaps by satisfying fundamental psychological needs like relatedness and affiliation, making us feel more securely connected. So, for an educator, building a classroom culture where students feel their fundamental values like fairness, kindness, curiosity, persistence, or even simply being a good friend are genuinely affirmed and celebrated can create a dramatically safer, more open learning environment. This reduces their inherent need to be overly defensive about academic performance, allowing them to engage more authentically with the learning process, take risks, and be more receptive to constructive feedback. It's quite powerful.
This sounds almost too good to be true sometimes. If extreme self-enhancement has its downsides, why would it be so pervasive? Is there an evolutionary reason for it, even with its occasional drawbacks?
Indeed. From an evolutionary perspective, self-enhancement may function as a powerful anti-dithering and anti-rumination device. Think about our ancestors facing immediate threats or opportunities. Dwelling on one's shortcomings or endlessly weighing options could be fatal. Self-enhancement provides the psychic fuel, the optimism and confidence, to persevere despite setbacks, to commit to action. It coveries strongly with positive mood and greater persistence, helping to induce and maintain those pleasant feelings and goal-directedness that people need to keep going, to fight, to flee, or to pursue resources. It's also significant that self-enhancement often kicks in after a decision has been made or when a situation is largely unchangeable. Once you've chosen a path or once you're in an unavoidable situation, self-enhancement helps people decisively commit themselves to a course of action or reconcile themselves to where they now stand, reducing regret and fostering forward movement. So, while extreme self-enhancement has clear downsides, a moderate dose, a kind of healthy illusion, might be evolutionarily adaptive for survival and action, even if it means some deviation from strict rationality or a fully accurate self-assessment in every moment.
That makes a lot of sense, framing it as a survival mechanism. Okay, before we wrap up the consequences, let's briefly touch on cultural differences in self-enhancement, because that's often where universal principles meet local norms and things get wonderfully complex.
It's a complex and highly debated area in cross-cultural psychology. The central question often revolves around whether self-enhancement is significantly weaker or even absent in collectivistic cultures compared to individualistic ones. The findings, as our source highlights, are quite nuanced, not a simple yes or no. While people in both cultures show some forms of self-enhancement, for example, on traits valued in their own culture, and implicitly collectivistic cultures may indeed refrain from direct or overt self-enhancement, like making blatant self-serving attributions, largely due to strong modesty norms and an emphasis on group harmony. What's truly fascinating is that in collectivistic cultures, modesty itself can actually be a source of self-enhancement. By appearing humble and downplaying one's achievements, an individual might gain social approval and respect, which indirectly enhances their self-regard within their social group. Furthermore, people in collectivistic cultures might often expect close others, family members, close friends, or community leaders to self-enhance on their behalf, rather than doing it themselves.
Oh, interesting. Like outsourcing the bragging.
It's sort of, yeah. It highlights the intricate dance between individual and group identity, where the universal human desire for a positive self-view might be expressed in culturally appropriate, indirect, and often group-oriented ways. So it's not necessarily that the motive is weaker, but that its expression is profoundly shaped by cultural context.
That's a crucial distinction. It's about how the accelerator is applied, not necessarily whether it exists. Okay, now as we bring this deep dive toward a close, let's revisit something fundamental that we touched on at the beginning. The idea that identity is not isolated. It's not just a cognitive construct floating in space.
Right. It's vitally important to reiterate that identity is just a cognitive aspect of a larger, much more holistic self. It never develops in isolation. From infancy, it's intimately linked with affect, our emotions and feelings, and agency, our capacity to act in the world, to make choices, and to pursue goals. These three pillars, cognition, identity, affect, emotion, and agency action, are deeply intertwined.
So, to illustrate these crucial connections, our source points out that clearly construing oneself, having a well-defined, coherent identity, is strongly linked to regarding oneself positively. That's the profound cognitive affective link. Knowing who you are helps you feel good about who you are. And then, regarding oneself positively, feeling good about who you are, is linked to greater persistence under adversity and an increased capacity for goal pursuit. That's the powerful, effective agentic link. Feeling good about yourself provides the fuel and resilience to act and persevere. It's a powerful chain reaction. Understand yourself, feel good about yourself, and you're better able to act and persevere in the face of challenges.
This intertwined nature of identity, affect, and agency is powerfully illustrated by the classic concept of an identity crisis, as first described by Erik Erikson. It's never just a crisis in cognitive coherence, a simple confusion about who am I or what are my goals. Our source highlights that an identity crisis is almost always also typically intertwined with a profound self-positivity crisis, where people find themselves forced to entertain shamefully negative self-evaluations, asking themselves agonizing questions like, why am I so inadequate? Or why do I feel so worthless? And, critically, it's also a self-goals crisis, where people feel paralyzed, unable to act to fulfill crucial basic needs or move forward, wondering, why can't I make progress? Why can't I seem to do anything? What's truly fascinating and heartbreaking here is the deep, inseparable link between how we define ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, and our fundamental ability to take action in the world. They are fundamentally inseparable.
And this has incredibly profound implications for every child in your classroom, and frankly, for anyone navigating their identity. Our source uses the powerful and poignant example of adolescents embracing a homosexual or gender identity in societies that are repressive or hostile towards them. When society refuses to recognize their identity, actively disapproves of their conduct, or imposes severe sanctions, it impacts all three dimensions in a devastating way. First, cognitive. They have immense trouble defining who they are sexually or in terms of gender identity, leading to confusion and internal conflict. Second, affective. They have profound trouble evaluating their sexuality or gender positively, leading to shame, guilt, and pervasive negative emotions. And third, agency. They experience immense trouble achieving the fundamental goal of expressing their sexuality or gender freely and authentically, limiting their capacity to act on their desires and be true to themselves. Now, apply this powerful framework to any child whose core identity or natural expression is subtly or overtly devalued, constrained, or simply not understood within a school or social environment. For instance, consider a child who is naturally highly energetic, expressive, and perhaps a kinesthetic learner. If the prevailing classroom culture strictly values quiet, sedentary behavior and punishes movement or vocal expression, this child might repeatedly face social devaluation or behavioral constraints. This can lead to them questioning their true self. Am I bad for being energetic? That's a cognitive problem. Feeling bad about who they are, I must be a problem child, an affective problem. And struggling to express themselves authentically or engage in their natural learning style, I can't move, so I can't think, an agency problem. All of this significantly impacts their overall well-being, their sense of belonging, and crucially, their capacity for learning. This brings us back to that crucial question for you, the educator. How can you create environments, classrooms, school cultures where all dimensions of identity are not just tolerated, but truly understood, supported, and even celebrated? How can you foster psychological flourishing rather than inadvertently creating conditions that lead to crisis for every single child you guide? It's a huge responsibility. So let's recap our deep dive today. We've seen that identity is a remarkably multifaceted and dynamic thing, a consequential subset of our self-construals that are shaped by language and reflective thought. We learned that the self is much broader than just identity, profoundly encompassing our emotions, our capacity for action. We explored the powerful and pervasive motives of self-enhancement, our accelerator, constantly pushing for positivity and self-assessment, our brake, grounding us in accuracy. We saw how they constantly compete and influence us, and how their consequences are complex. Moderate self-enhancement can be adaptive, providing psychic fuel, but fragile self-esteem has its clear downsides. And we discovered that self-affirmation offers a healthy, powerful way to balance these forces, fostering resilience and openness. Ultimately, our identity is constantly being shaped by these incredible dynamics, and it's always intertwined with how we feel about ourselves and our fundamental ability to act in the world.
And this leaves us with a final provocative thought, especially for you in your vital and profound role in education. If identity is a lifelong, dynamic construction, and if our emotional well-being and our very ability to act in the world are so deeply tied to how we define and value ourselves, well, how might your understanding of these intricate identity dynamics, this constant interplay of the accelerator and the brake shape, the way you foster self-discovery, resilience, and authentic expression in the young minds you guide every single day? We truly encourage you to observe these powerful accelerator and brake dynamics in yourselves, in your colleagues, and most importantly, in the children within your learning environment. You'll start seeing them everywhere, I promise.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the inner workings of identity. So what does this all mean for you as you step into your classroom tomorrow? We hope you'll continue exploring this fascinating and profoundly important subject.